Thank you for listening to Taking Up Space. We would like to emphasize that taking up space is not a substitute for speaking with a licensed therapist or physician. We hope to encourage discussion around the topics brought up throughout the show. The views and opinions expressed are the speaker's own, and we can only speak from our perspective, and we encourage you, as our audience, to listen to all of the perspectives shared here with an open mind and heart, and then form your own. You can find us on Instagram at BIPOC Healing Podcast, where we also have a GoFundMe linked for any donations to help keep our center running. We hope you enjoyed the episode. The content discussed in this episode may be troublesome for people to hear. Before, during, and after listening to the episode, please make sure to practice some self-care activities, however that looks for you. Some of our favorite methods here at Taking Up Space include journaling, going for a walk, connecting with a loved one, eating a good meal, or just taking a few deep breaths and some time for ourselves. If you find yourself in any distress after this episode, please contact a licensed physician or clinician for further support. Thanks for joining us on this week's episode. So last week we discussed imposter syndrome. We looked at the definition. Rehana had that wonderful article where we looked at the definition from a BIPOC perspective. And we realized we don't want to just leave you hanging. So this week we do want to discuss some of the ways that we can combat imposter syndrome. We're going to talk about some of the day-to-day activities, the little things you can do, by yourself or even with a few friends, and then go into some of the bigger community and systemic solutions and some of that systemic change that we can do by really claiming our space as a way to combat imposter syndrome. So to start off, honestly, this one has been my biggest game changer, my biggest trick, and it's looking at the facts. And when I didn't realize other people did this too, but when we were researching for this episode, it's pretty common where people just say, read over your resume, right? With imposter syndrome, there's such a big idea of I haven't achieved enough, or what I have achieved isn't good enough, or maybe it's not really indicative of who I am. There's all of these things. And so if you can look at your resume and say, hold on, I did take that class. I took this degree. I had that presentation, whatever it is, but you can see it laid out on a piece of paper. It just makes it more real, and it just helps you kind of ground yourself and remove some of those thoughts, those spiraling thoughts. The other thing, looking at your friend groups, right? Like, just look at your friend groups, look at the messages that they've sent, look at the communication you have with your friends. If so many people like you, then you've got to be a pretty cool person. So chances are that imposter syndrome, it's just another way of just kind of combating some of those negative self-talk. Reena, you look like you had something you wanted to add. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was like thinking that sometimes what we go through in terms of perhaps people making us feel like we haven't achieved something or that we're lesser than, which is often what happens with imposter syndrome. And we talked about that last time, where it's so much related to the world around us and the environment of how BIPOC are treated and how our accomplishments are like diminished. And so I often really look at how valuable it can be to be reminded of the truth of what we actually like are, because so much of the time, like based upon that treatment, like our truth becomes skewed. We start to believe what other people, what these like systems, what our workplaces are saying about us. And sometimes I find it really helpful to actually just remind myself of like, hey, no, wait, like you're actually pretty cool, Reena. Like you've done this, and this is like what you have to show for, and like this is what your friends love about you, and really kind of like rooting myself in that. And I guess some people would consider that to be like positive affirmations or positive self-talk. But I think it's also just standing in our truth because so much of the time we get our truth taken from us or our truth rewritten by others. And so this is kind of a way to reclaim it is to name it for ourselves and actually be reminded of like what it actually is. Because I think as humans, we are so prone to focusing on the negative in terms of maybe like the missing pieces, like the deficits, what we don't have, or like, maybe things that we think are flaws about ourselves. And I see that from a survival perspective, that sometimes if we look at those flaws or those things that we want that we don't have, then there's something in there that helps us to survive, to be able to go and get that, to kind of meet that need or achieve that thing. And a lot of times, as racialized people, we live in survival. So I can understand why our brains go there, but our brains can, rewire and change. What we feed our brains really like matters. And like you said, having people around us who also feed that kind of like that positive food for the brain is really helpful. So I just wanted to add on to that.
No, thank you for adding. And yeah, I mean, it's such a big thing who you have in your circle, who's in your life, who, right? And I know that we talk, like you mentioned, positive affirmations, and I know it can be so hard to start that off for yourself. And so this is actually something that I've done only a few times now with my friend groups, but we'll do a thing where we'll sit in a circle, we'll have a dinner, it's someone's birthday, whatever it is, and then we go around and we just say, like everybody says one positive thing about the person in the center, right? So it's like, okay, now everyone go ahead and say what you love about this person, what their friendship means to you, something like that, what their strength is, whatever that is. And obviously, you can adapt this to however you need to for your friend group or for yourself. But it's just such a nice little reminder. And then when you're having a bad day, you can be like, wait a minute, my friend said that this was about me, and like I believe her, so yeah, like I trust her, I think I agree with this, or right. And just having those little things like you said to say like, yeah, Rena is really really cool, you're a badass, like you're incredible, you've done all of these things. And just but having that with the external influence and that community support, it's huge. And then that actually ties into the second thing that I was going to talk about, which is celebrating your wins. I think there's so much in our lives that we do not celebrate. And even as we grow older, like even birthdays aren't that much of a deal. You know how, remember when you were little and your parents would make a huge fuss or somebody would make a fuss, and even in classrooms and stuff like that, everybody would get a birthday cupcake, everybody would get a slice of cake or a card or something like that. And it was always a thing, someone's birthday, right? And then as we grow older, it's like, oh, whatever, I'm just turning another year older, not a big deal. Like I know my parents don't really do too much for their birthdays. I go out of my way. I'm like, you have to do something for your birthday, right? Like you still have to do it. Or like my grandpa's birthday, he didn't celebrate it until he was like his first birthday party when he was 90. He's like, I just never had a birthday party, right? And even those little things that we just kind of have stopped celebrating as we've grown older. And then we celebrate the big things, absolutely, but just celebrate the little wins too. Celebrate all of them. And maybe don't have a party for everything. Maybe that's not feasible, but you got out of bed today. Great. Grab yourself a little coffee. Oh, you know what? You finished the book that you've been meaning to finish. Okay, grab yourself a cookie or something. Just get a little treat, something to celebrate the little stuff. And especially with imposter syndrome, celebrating that, you know what? Maybe your presentation didn't go as well as you wanted it to, but you did it. And that's a win in itself. That's a big deal in of itself. So if you can even celebrate that section, again, celebrating that with your community or by yourself, whatever feels more authentic to you, whatever feels more valuable to you in that moment, I think is a really good way of combating that imposter syndrome. And also taking just a little bit of that space back as well with that, right? Because you're in your brain, you're not letting those thoughts take up any more space than you're giving them. And then I think this was one that you actually mentioned, Rehana, was talking to people about imposter syndrome, so that way you don't feel as isolated.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's definitely come up with like some previous clients I had. Like we actually did like discuss imposter syndrome a lot. That's such a common pattern. And even just knowing that like it is a common pattern, that there are other people who struggle with it. Like I had one person say to me like, "Oh wow, that actually makes me feel so much better just knowing like it's not just me, like it's an actual like universal experience or like almost universal experience among so many other people." So just kind of normalizing that. And I like what you mentioned about the affirmations, like going around the circle about friends. I wanted to just say that because I thought that was a really cute idea, Crystal. And I actually like on a side note, like I also I will sometimes go on YouTube because they have like YouTube affirmations and just play it in the background while I'm like, I don't know, like taking a bath or just doing some work or something. And then and it's so true what you said about like sometimes it's like hard, like because you have these initial thoughts that come up where it's like if I'm listening to an affirmation, it's like, I am worthy, I am strong. I'm like, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. But then eventually, like, it kind of like starts becoming a part of our process, which also like that's what you were mentioning, Rena, where it's like our brains are so malleable and like it is possible to rewire our brains with like the information that we're giving ourselves and like the people that we surround ourselves with. So yeah.
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 Maybe the affirmations that we can tell ourselves don't have to be those like really cheesy, positive, cheery ones that
Right.
don't actually feel truthful. I
Hmm.
often will encourage folks to meet yourself where you're at.
Yeah.
Find things that you can say to yourself that actually do feel maybe a bit more neutral. So instead of really blaming ourselves or putting ourselves down, the really negative thoughts, maybe we can find ways to reframe that in a way that is more neutral, that feels more believable, like something like I'm doing what I can, instead of like I am great or I'm doing the best, because oftentimes that actually isn't accessible and doesn't feel supportive. It just feels like we're, lying or tricking ourselves. So that can be helpful, is just work with where you're at. And often, sometimes I kind of think of what would I say to a good friend? Like, how would I treat and encourage those that I love? Or what would they say to me? Like, and I kind of play those out in my head as well, where I think of those kinds of conversations and how I can apply it to myself so that I can feel more worthy. Because I think one of the big themes that has come up for me in my sessions with racialized folks with imposter syndrome is really feeling like this deep sense of like unworthiness. Like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm really just inherently, I feel like I'm not good enough. And I can't shake this feeling of not being worthy and not feeling like I deserve to do these things that are good for me or say these good things about myself. And so it can often feel really daunting to kind of like chip away at the imposter syndrome because it's so deeply entrenched and rooted in our identities. So I often will encourage folks to just kind of take it like teeny tiny baby steps. Like we really are like chipping away at it one little piece at a time. And that uh, can even start with something like pretty small, pretty neutral, and just go from there.
Adding on to the affirmations, you mentioned that you had affirmations playing on YouTube and stuff. Do you remember when Snoop Dogg came out with that like kid song of the
Oh,
affirmations, like the kindergarten one?
that one's really cute.
It was so cute, and I remember
Yeah.
I played it once, and I was like, I, I fully went into it like rolling my eyes. I was like, this is gonna be horrible. And I was like, Snoop Dogg, like, what are you doing? This is great. This is what every one of us needs right now.
Yeah.
So just and even incorporating that just in your little like listen while you're brushing your teeth, right? Even that like 1 minute, 2 minutes that you're doing some washing your face and you just have a little bit of that audio, like you're saying, incorporating those little changes makes such a difference.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's for another resource, and we can link these in our podcast description, is the NAP ministry. Trisha Hersey, she has this really cool like rest deck that offers affirmations that are specifically for like Black folks and people of color, to really honor and integrate like affirmations that encourage us to slow down and rest and not have to be so productive and not have to be machines of capitalism. And I find her affirmations are also very like they're not like so outrageous that they're not believable. They're very, I think, meet yourself where you're at and soothe yourself. Tell yourself these things that you can do, that you can rest. So that could also be a really good one, is like finding ones that are really tailored for you. And there are ones out there that are geared towards people of color. So, I think that's really important to like find your resources of what works for you. Don't try to like kind of make something fit if it doesn't fit.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought of another one that I wanted to bring up. Just like more in the like academia workplace spaces, just in, with imposter syndrome, there's that idea of I don't know enough. Like if I give a presentation, everyone's gonna know that I don't actually know what I'm talking about. I don't know what this gene does. I don't know what, this bar graph is about, whatever it is. Um, and that's having, if you have a mentor or if you have a supervisor or a manager or someone that you look up to and that you can go to and say, just tell me, just be completely honest. Is there something I'm missing? Does it seem like, in your opinion, in your expertise, in your experience, would you say that I seem knowledgeable enough on this topic? Right? And of course, this is only if you have a mentor or a supervisor that you feel safe with, that gives you the space to do all of this. And I recognize that unfortunately, that's not a reality for a lot of people. It is hard to have those like trustworthy supervisors and mentors in the workplace. But if you can find that, even if that is not necessarily in your specific workplace, but in your field, something like that, where you have that bit of a companionship where you can say, does this sound okay, right? Like, does this sound like I know what I'm talking about? Or is there some major flaw in my logic or in the way that I'm describing this? Because then it's that kind of extra reassurance, especially this is something I like to do before I give presentations because I'm always worried about the questions that are going to come up at the end of it. And then it's a nice way to know, you know what, maybe this is a section I need to look at, or no, this is good, I'm good. And like, I'm kind of on par with all of the other presenters. Like, I'm okay, I'm in a good space right now, right? So I think if you can develop that connection or have that connection, definitely take advantage of it. Use it as another resource if you're able to.
Hmm. Yeah, connections are so important. I found a lot of solace in connecting with safe fellow like racialized people in my environments, workplaces, people that you can kind of go to that are like, hey, this is like, our values line up. Like, are you seeing this too? Or, what are you noticing here? And sometimes that's not always like available for folks when they might be the only like racialized person in a workplace. And that can be really tricky, but even finding like safe allies or, anyone that you can feel like gets you or like will listen to you and believe you can be really helpful. And, whether it's at the place that you're at or outside of it, like finding our like allies in life, I think is really important.
Yeah. Well, and those are our friends, right? Those are the people. Those are the ones in our corner that aren't competing against you, that are just cheering you on. There's that like little meme of Lightning McQueen. I think it's Lightning McQueen in the stands, right? And then there's like a car around the racetrack, and then does anyone, do either of you know what
I
I'm
think
talking about?
I know what you're talking
Right, and
about. I
it's
think
like,
I've seen it.
and like Lightning McQueen or whatever, whoever the car
From the
is
Cars
in the,
movie.
yeah, yeah, from movies. Okay, it's a good movie. I stand by it. But it's like the car in the audience, and it's just cheering him on. Like every other car is quiet, and just like cheering him on so loudly, and people will be like, "Me struggling in school," and they're like, this car's like going around the lot. It's like my mom cheering me on, right? But like that's what it
Aw.
is. Like you need those people. You need those people to cheer you on when you are struggling, when you're not struggling, when they're struggling.
Mhm.
They should still be cheering you on in whatever capacity they can.
Yeah,
But you need that.
Mhm.
You need those connections,
yeah,
however you can find them, wherever you can find them.
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
That's so fair. I think that really segues into like this idea that we wanted to bring forward for our like big, kind of bigger picture systemic change that we wanted to focus on is intentional community. So we kind of mentioned in our last episode, and we've started to mention today that there is like the importance of having that solidarity in those BIPOC, racialized spaces, finding colleagues at work or people who you can connect with who really like get it from a lived experience. And so we've been thinking a lot and doing some research on why BIPOC spaces are so important. And so we wanted to kind of bring that forward. I know, Rehana, you found an article that really relates to that. So maybe we could discuss that a little bit more, and then how it relates to what we're doing at the center.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So there's an article by Kelsey Blackwell, who's an activist. She's done some awesome writings. One of her books is called Decolonizing the Body, which I honestly really recommend that read. Like, I think we're probably going to do a podcast on that later on because that in
Mm-hmm.
itself deserves its own like topic for sure. But she actually has an article that we came across called Why People of Color Need Spaces Without White People. And I just wanted to read like an excerpt from the article that really paints a picture of what really resonated with us. So it says, we need spaces where we can be our authentic selves without white people's judgment and insecurity muzzling that expression. We need spaces where we can simply be, where we can get off the treadmill of making white people comfortable and finally realize just how tired we are. Valuing and protecting spaces for people of color is not just a kind thing that white people can do to help us feel better. Supporting these spaces is crucial to the resistance of oppression. When people of color are together, there can be healing. We can reclaim parts of ourselves that have been repressed. We can redefine ourselves and support one another in embracing who we are. The necessity of these spaces is obvious to me as a woman of color, learning to embrace layers of my own identity by being in community with other Black and Brown bodies. This has been especially important in my spiritual community, Shambhala Buddhism, where we are taught that surfacing vulnerability is the path to creating a more fair and just society. Yet, in my own organizing of a POC meditation in Oakland and in conversations with other people of color in my Sangha across the United States, I've been angered and baffled by the responses of white people to these spaces. Though people of color are creating and envisioning spaces in which we may be together, our efforts are continually questioned, attacked, and made invisible within our communities. Spaces for people of color are ignored even when they attract large numbers. They are marginalized from other community events and programming. Community leaders find reasons to question the legitimacy of POC groups and may interrogate organizers about what exactly we're doing when we get together. Some white people insert themselves into POC spaces with reasons why they believe they should be included, such as, I identify more with people of color than with white people. There are people who accuse people of color spaces as being racist and segregationist.
Wow, that's really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's unpack that because I
Yeah, that
think
was a lot, hey?
that was like really valuable. So I wanted to comment on like just what I'm getting from this article is how much power and support comes from these BIPOC spaces
Mhm.
where we can see ourselves amongst people with like similar lived experiences. We can see ourselves represented. Um, and we can kind of like support each other because we understand this like sense of how our like liberation is kind of bound up in each other, right? Like we've
Yeah.
all experienced like our own kinds of experiences in this world, and then we can like see each other in our different and similar experiences and
Yeah.
understand like how, you know, us getting on board with each other and supporting each other is our pathway to freedom.
Right.
And I think it's really valuable to have like white allies who will support us being able to like, you know, gather, like not inserting themselves in there, not questioning or, you know, really kind of, yeah, making us feel like we can't exist or gather. And that's certainly something we've gotten at the center is we've gotten some questioning, we've gotten some backlash, we've gotten some white folks who have been like, what are you doing? I mean, we've gotten even BIPOC folks who are like, what are you doing? So there is a lot of questioning happening, and when I read articles like this, it roots me in the truth of why we are doing what we're doing. And, you know, I think that calling this like segregationist is coming from a place of fragility. It's coming from a place of fear, that like
Mm-hmm.
what will happen when they gather and talk to each other. Does that mean bad things for us? And I think, I often look at the white folks in my life who are really supportive of the initiative that we're doing for BIPOC at our center. I look at like my partner who is like a white man and often says like, he was like, yeah, you need your space that's like away from
Mm-hmm.
my whiteness. You
Yeah.
need your space that is with other racialized people. Like that is an important aspect of identity that you need to connect with. That like, is not my place to be inserting myself into, but it's my place to like amplify and uplift and cheer on and encourage you having that space. And that's really important to me in loving you and, being that ally to you. So that's kind of how I see it, is like that is a gift that like white folks can offer, is just like stay out of our way, let us have our spaces, and support these spaces.
And
Absolutely.
um, first of all, shout out to Jeremy. He's great. We love Jeremy. But no, like I think what he said is something about it just really resonated. We said like we need our spaces. Obviously, that's what the whole conversation's been about. But when you think about it, think about we all have our spaces in some other aspect of our life, right? I I like the gym, so the gym is a space for me, right? If you like football, then chances are one of the bars that's hosting like a football game, like the hosting the Super Bowl, that's a space for you. Or hockey, right? Whenever there's an Oilers game on, every bar in town has the Oilers game playing, and then that's a space for Oilers fans. And that's totally fine because it's your interest, right? And this goes far beyond what our interests are. But just as people in general, we have our own spaces, right? We have our bedrooms when we want to just be alone and have a little space to ourselves. We have our favorite cafes with our friends when we want to catch up with them, right? We have I don't know, like the gym, like I said earlier, when you want to exercise, whatever it is, we all already have spaces and we already share these spaces with people who have common interests with us. Like, this isn't a new idea that we're bringing forth. This isn't some revolutionary idea. It's just saying, hey, I just want to have a space where I can hang out with friends who understand this part of my life.
Mhm.
That's it. That's all we're saying. Like, I just want a space that I can hang out with my friends and I can have a samosa and make, Bollywood references and someone's gonna get it and they're gonna laugh with me and that's it. We want those spaces where we feel comfortable, where we feel safe, just like we do in all of the other spaces in our lives. It's just that the part of us that feels comfortable in these spaces that we're discussing is the part that needs to be surrounded by people who look like us and by people who've had similar experiences as us. It's like it's just a space for you to feel comfortable
Yeah.
just like we have with everything else in our lives.
It's so true. Like I never really thought that much about how much of myself that I mask until like recently when because I have a lot of amazing white friends who like thankfully like I feel really like grateful because like they're so understanding, like they get it, like they do the research, like they take initiative to like, and even just having that humility of like I don't understand some things and I probably will never understand and I'm not going to try to understand. I mean, I will try, but like even then, like because of my experience as a white person, like I don't know what it's like to have family members and ancestors that have endured slavery and like all of these like experiences like historically and generationally that people of color have had to face. Like there's just a lot that even just with words, like it's just hard to explain, and just being in those spaces where other people just get it, the
It's just
mask comes off.
it's a feeling,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And even like in my own experience as a Guyanese woman, um, like I think about my experience in like Kerry West, which is like once a year in August. There's a festival called Kerry West where all of the Guyanese, Trini, Jamaican people get together. They get to have fun. They get to eat together, have like such a great like festive time. And all of a sudden, this like soca girl in me comes out. I'm like, this feels like me, but I just don't always get a chance to express this because where else do I have the space to experience this Carrie West vibe. Like, this is my one time a year in August that I get to experience it. And then it just brings out this side of me that I feel is still like such a big part of me, but I just don't have a space to like express that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And like, don't get me wrong, like I went through phases where I was like, I was all about that punk music. I love me some like, you know, ABBA, like 70s, 80s music, things like that. Like I can relate to like Western culture in a lot of ways. So like I feel like it's not necessarily a mask, but like there's that's just one side of me where like I get to show people, but it's not the whole thing. So when I'm around people of color, especially like Guyanese people, it's like a part of me comes out that I get to feel like, oh, okay, like this is who I am. Like all cards are on the table.
Yeah.
And that goes so much into intersectionality, which of course we'll talk about in another episode, but right, like that idea that there's so many parts of our identities, and this is true for every single person. There is not a single person out there that is just one thing. Everybody has so many parts of their identities. That's the definition of intersectionality of, how all of these parts of our identities play together. But for us, that feeling that you were describing, I was like, I felt that feeling. And that's the feeling I get when I can go to an Indian grocery store. Like when I go back home, like when I'm going to India, I know I'm going to feel that part of me that just doesn't, like, it's always there, but never feels alive until I'm in that space. Right. And like I said, everybody has those parts. It's just what spaces can those parts come alive in? And unfortunately for us, we don't have that many spaces accessible to us. We don't have that many spaces ready to go where we can go and just like have that part of us come back to life, right? Or have that part kind of like that flame get ignited where I don't know how what words to use. Like you said, it's a feeling. It's just
Yeah.
this like feeling of you. And I
Yeah.
think, for anyone listening, if you're trying to figure out this feeling that we're talking about and trying to relate to it, to me, it would be that sense, it's almost that feeling of purpose combined with this feeling of full freedom. So think about a time in your life where you was just like it was like that picture perfect, like if your life was a movie, the sun would be shining, the birds would be singing, like everything's going perfect, and you just don't feel any worries, and you just feel like you can finally breathe freely and completely, and it's just you're just there, you're just existing, and the whole world kind of stops for a moment. You're like, I'm just here, like I'm a person and I'm enjoying this to the full capacity. That is the feeling that we're talking about, that feeling of just you just get to exist in the moment. There's no thinking about, okay, how do I look? Okay, wait, am I too Indian for this? Okay, is my voice coming off a little bit too much with an Indian accent right now at work? Okay, wait, is it coming off with not enough of an Indian accent? Is it like all of these things that we think about on a regular basis? And these are just minor things in a few examples, but all of that just stops. It stops, and like to me, it's just like for me, it's that feeling that I get when I'm like sitting in the sun, right?
Mm.
That same thing of like the sun's on your face, like you're smiling, everything's good. And yeah, so if you're listening, trying to relate, like that's the feeling we're talking about. And I'm hopefully a few of you can relate to this feeling.
Yeah, I know I can for sure. Like, often what I can describe it as is like this presence. Like, in the mental health world, there's so much emphasis on mindfulness as a concept of taking care of our mental health through being like fully present in the moment, being with ourselves, being with our five senses, being rooted and grounded in something. And I think that this is the feeling that a lot of racialized people get when we can be in intentional spaces that represent these parts of us that maybe we have to water down in other spaces, maybe don't get to be fully expressed. I can describe it as kind of this flow state where I really feel just like so like connected to myself, but simultaneously connected to the world around me and people, and just like liveliness. And it reminds me of one of the ways that I've really tried to connect with my roots and my culture as, a Canadian born South Asian person is through like yoga. Yoga is something that as a child I grew up doing with my grandma, and that was kind of a piece of culture that she really like retained and held on to from India, and survived the immigration of coming to Canada and really kind of reclaimed it as like this ancient wisdom because of how much it made her feel connected to back home. And, it was even banned in like British colonial times back home. And so, my grandma and I like grew up kind of using yoga as medicine, and in yoga, which means like bliss, enlightenment, and it's this feeling of just pure calm peace within oneself and peace with humanity. And I see that as being a possibility that we can like reach this bliss or enlightenment through accessing these safe spaces of being together as racialized people. And I think that is something that we are really like striving towards and carving out through our center is, how do we create this like level of just, connection, safety, like being seen, um, taking up space as we reference in our podcast. And a lot of us, can maybe take up space even bigger and in a different way in these spaces than we can in perhaps other spaces in our lives. So that's the really big importance of it.
Yeah, it makes such a big difference. And like especially demographically, it's like we don't really like you mentioned, like we don't really have like a space where we can just kind of be ourselves. And like I feel like the center, like the values of the center being like a safe space for people of color, like it really makes such a big difference in both like the staff and the clients as well. Yeah, so I'm just gonna read another quote from Kelsey Blackwell's article, where she mentions it wasn't until I was in POC only spaces that I realized how much of myself I had to cut off to fit into white culture. So being in POC spaces allows me to reclaim those forgotten parts of myself. And then she goes on also to kind of talk about how in these spaces we can share stories about the discrimination we faced and find understanding and support. We can define ourselves on our own terms. When white people are present, this crucial examining usually doesn't happen. Sharing our experiences in integrated spaces often means preparing to defend our anger and frustration or taking care of white individuals who find what is being said hurtful. This means that when POC do take the leap to share painful experiences, white listeners often shift the focus back onto themselves and their own grievances. Thus, attention and power implicitly shift back to white individuals, reinforcing the status quo. There can also arise a need to translate our experiences into terms that white listeners will be more sympathetic to in order to be heard. Genuine allyship requires genuine listening, especially when that listening is hard to be with.
Mhm.
So like yeah, essentially it just really takes a lot of humility with white allies. Like I think that's something that I notice with my friends is like they just have so much humility and understanding, and it's so healing to be around white folks who have that. And like
Mhm.
how you said, like Jeremy, your partner just immediately understood how important it is to have this space for
Mhm.
people of color. And in the article too, like Kelsey mentions a section where she's like, you know, I guess quote unquote, but isn't this just segregation? And then she goes on to answer it as these spaces aren't acts of oppression, but rather responses to it. They are our opportunity to be with each other away from the abuse of racism and patterns of white dominance. Given that space to breathe, there's the possibility of healing. Being together can offer resiliency for bringing our fullness into integrated spaces where it will inevitably be challenged.
Amazing. Thank you for reading those excerpts. That sounds really
Oh,
powerful. And I think that's so important to highlight her point around like these being like, kind of ways that we are reclaiming ourselves. Like we're not, oppressing or excluding anyone. And that's not the purpose of what we're creating. And having these BIPOC spaces is a way to really include folks who have been underrepresented, who haven't had these spaces that they've needed. And that creation of these spaces are so important for healing. And so I think that's kind of the point that we really want to emphasize, is that we have created these spaces for a specific kind of population of people, to represent people, to include people, not to exclude anyone. And this comment around like the segregation piece, I also want to address that, where, you know, we can't compare like what we're doing, the creation of these spaces, to the institution of segregation, because that institution is something that was done as a way to have power over people of color, to, control and manage and keep out, to intentionally exclude people of color historically. And so that has been, an act that was oppressive, because it was utilized as like a power force. And I know we haven't explored a lot about power and privilege on this podcast, to the extent that we would like to yet. So that is going to be something that I think we want to deep dive more into, at a later time, that we want to do some justice to that. So we'll circle back to that. But I do want to, just kind of mention that what we are doing, it's not from a place of power. It's not, kind of utilizing that for like, a gain of power. It's to reclaim our own personal identities, through being together. And so, when we create these intentional spaces, I guess like it would fit this definition of an intentional segregation. And when I say that, I don't say that with the, with the emphasis being on segregating. We're not here to kind of like remove ourselves from the greater population. What we're here for is to create a space that just feels like us and feels like
Mhm.
home. And so it is creating that place where we can come home to, and then we can go back into our lives, and be who we need to in our lives, and be around, racialized people, white people, and feel empowered that we were able to like be around people who can just talk about things that we experience. And here at the center, that's maybe talking about racism, or, traumas that we've experienced regarding racism, intergenerational traumas. But it's not just that. It's also, you know, let's just be together in our joy too. Let's just be together in representing experiences that we really like to have together. Like, I really like to share this food or this culture with people, and just be together in that too. So it's, this is a space for everyone, whether, they are a racialized person focusing on racism, in their therapy, or if they're just kind of focusing on what's going on for them day to day. There's a space for them.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I really hear you. Like it's not about this idea of like elitism or inferiority or anything like that. It's just about carving out a space where we can heal together and come together, not just like, with our trauma, but also just share joy and share that culture and that love for our ethnicity, our backgrounds, and just to be able to just comfortably sit in that and share that with
Mm.
others.
Yeah, a place to explore that as it relates to other parts of our lives. Like just,
Yeah.
the possibilities that can come from that, I think are really cool and powerful, where people can kind of use this space as they need, as what fits for them, where there's the invitation to explore or not. And this
Mhm.
is a space where you get to decide that.
Yeah, we're calling in our BIPOC folks.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
Hmm.
Amazing. Yeah, this is such an important conversation. Thank you for bringing this forward. I think that, yeah, we really wanted to just emphasize, like, why we've created this kind of space. And, yeah, more conversation on this, I'm sure will come.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone.
If you are interested in further resources and readings, you can find some articles referenced in the episode description. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode. We would like to thank everyone involved at the BIPOC Healing and Wellness Center, our staff, volunteers, and community members. Special thanks to Kaven, Landry, and Jeremy for the behind-the-scenes support. You can find us on Instagram at BIPOC Healing Podcast, where we also have a GoFundMe link for any donations to help keep our center running. We're extremely grateful for your support, and as always, we hope you take up some space however that looks for you.